Welcome to this first lesson about Gothic fiction or the literature of terror. I will begin by telling you the history of the term Gothic and explain how and why the term changed over time. You're also going to learn that Gothic literature was created in reaction to the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment. And towards the end of this screencast recording, I will touch upon the main characteristics of traditional Gothic fiction and contrast this with yet another subgenre of Romanticism, namely New American Gothic fiction. Enjoy! Nowadays, when we talk about Gothic fiction, we refer to a group of novels that were written between the 1760s and the 1820s, among which Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was published in 1818, and the first Gothic novel ever written in that period, which is Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, and this book was published in 1764. Now, these are some of the first Gothic texts ever written that are still well known today. As I just mentioned, The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole was the first Gothic novel ever written, but it wasn't very popular in the beginning when it was first published in 1764. The book's popularity didn't reach its peak until the 1790s, so a couple of decades later. With this novel, Walpole started a tradition which many authors copied afterwards, because it seemed to work quite well. So what did he do that was so unusual? Well, he pretended that he hadn't actually written the novel himself. Instead, he pretended to have found a mysterious manuscript which he had then edited and published. So Walpole and many authors after him believed that this gave the text authenticity. But let's go back to where the term Gothic comes from. In 376 AD, the Goths, among other Germanic tribes, invaded the Roman Empire, defeated the Roman forces, and created their own kingdoms in Italy and France. Okay, you might think so. Well, because the Goths destroyed the well-organized and civilized Roman Empire, they were seen as barbarous and wild and uncivilized. So originally the term Goth was very negative, but that changed in the course of the 18th century because the wildness, excess and exaggeration associated with Gothic became fashionable. And this was probably a reaction to the prevailing 18th century mood of reason and enlightenment. So what do I mean when I refer to the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment? Well, in 18th century Europe there was a strong emphasis on reason to advance knowledge. Great changes occurred in scientific thought during this period, and people finally rejected the medieval reliance on the Bible to find the truth, and they also rejected superstition and irrational explanations. In short, you could say that people questioned established beliefs in the church and other authorities in favor of reason and scientific proof. One of the leading figures of the scientific revolution that started in the 17th century was physicist and mathematician Sir Isaac Newton, who is most famous for his law of gravitation. The English poet Alexander Pope wrote an epitaph for Newton after his death. An epitaph is written after someone has died, and Pope wrote about Newton, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." There was no room for supernatural elements in the literature of the Enlightenment. It was, after all, the Age of Reason. But these supernatural and inexplicable elements started to reappear at the end of the 18th century in the form of Gothic fiction. Many historians see the rise of the Gothic as a response to the prevailing mode of rational thought and reason. Gothic writers were more interested in what was irrational. Not just the subgenre Gothic fiction, but the entire Romantic movement is all about the shift away from reason to emotions and feelings. If you place what is classic and what is Gothic side by side, you see the following. On the one hand, you have what is classic and civilized. On the other hand, you see what is wild, uncivilized, chaotic and primitive. On the left, you see reason and enlightenment. On the right, excess and exaggeration. On the left, you see classical culture and their examples, and on the right, you see its counterpart, the Dark Ages and medieval culture. The Gothic begins with later 18th century writers' turn to the past. In the context of the Romantic period, the Gothic is a type of imitation medievalism. Many Gothic novels are set in the past, in the Middle Ages. So you can see Gothic literature as the dark underbelly or the flip side of the Enlightenment or Age of Reason. Here you see a picture of Strawberry Hill, a neo-Gothic castle that was purchased by Horace Walpole in the 1740s. It can still be visited today. But let's move on to a list of characteristics of Gothic fiction. Now, first of all, the story usually takes place in medieval times and often in haunted castles, dark dungeons, prisons, monasteries, and vice and violence are part and parcel of Gothic stories. Authors tended to become quite sensationalist in describing situations of terror. There could also be supernatural elements, think of vampires, werewolves, or ghosts. And stories usually contain stereotypical villains and heroes, and rather weak heroines that are preyed upon by unspeakable terrors. Aside from the more traditional Gothic stories in which the terror, the fear comes from the outside, there's also the so-called New American Gothic fiction in which terror comes from the inside. From the inside because the narrator is stark raving mad. Examples of New American Gothic fiction are the stories written by Edgar Allan Poe called The Telltale Heart and The Black Cat. In these stories, the reader is asked to share a world seen and experienced through the distorted obsessions of the narrator's mind, and that world is one of social and mental decay. The terror that emerges in Poe's stories is the terror of obsession and insanity, and Edgar Allan Poe is famous for making very sophisticated use of the first-person narrative to tell these stories. Thank you for listening. Enjoy the course.